Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of New Mexico. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing to which places and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1889. New Mexico Territory was still 8 years from achieving statehood, and the remnants of the Old West lingered in the dust-choked settlements scattered across the Chihuahuan Desert. What happened in the small mining town of Lordsburg that autumn would eventually be sealed away in county records, mentioned only in hushed tones by the few remaining residents who outlived the century. It began with a discovery made by a railway worker named Thomas Finch. While inspecting a section of the Southern Pacific Railroad line approximately 7 miles east of Lordsburg, he noticed what appeared to be a leather satchel partially buried in the sand. The official report, filed with the Hidalgo County Sheriff on October 17, 1889, stated only that the satchel contained personal effects of unknown origin and was transferred to the Lordsburg Marshal's office for further examination. What the report failed to mention was the dried blood that had seeped into the leather, or the silver pocket watch inside that still ticked despite being covered in a substance that the railway worker refused to describe to anyone except the marshal. According to Thomas Finch's later statement to the territorial investigator, the pocket watch bore an inscription, "To Daniel for services rendered, 1885. This detail was omitted from the official report but recorded in Finch's personal journal, discovered among his effects after his death in 1901. The journal entry noted that Finch recognized the name Daniel as possibly belonging to the bounty hunter Daniel Bishop, whom he had seen in town just weeks earlier. Finch wrote that he considered this information too speculative to include in his official statement, but found it troubling enough to warrant documentation. The Marshal of Lordsburg in 1889 was James Hollister, a former cavalry officer who had settled in the territory after the Civil War. Hollister's military records, preserved in the National Archives, indicate he served with distinction in several campaigns against Confederate forces in Tennessee. What those records don't mention, but local accounts confirm, is that Hollister suffered from recurring nightmares that often left him unable to sleep for days at a time. Whether these nightmares influenced his handling of the case remains a matter of speculation among historians. The mining town of Lordsburg had sprung up around the Southern Pacific Railroad in 1880. By 1889, it housed approximately 500 souls, miners, railroad workers, merchants, and those who provided services to these men. On Shakespeare Street, set apart from the Methodist Church and the general store, stood a 2-story adobe structure known locally as the Sisters' Place. The establishment was not listed in any town directory, yet every man in Lordsburg knew of its existence. The property had originally been constructed in 1882 by a businessman from Chicago named Gerald Watson. County tax records indicate Watson paid for the construction with gold coins, an unusual transaction that raised eyebrows, but few questions in a frontier town where cash was often preferred over paper currency. Watson operated what he called a gentleman's social club for approximately 5 years before his sudden disappearance in early 1887. A registry book recovered from the property during the subsequent investigation contained the names of prominent visitors to Watson's establishment, including several territorial officials and at least one federal judge. This registry was reportedly stored in the Lordsburg Town Hall until a fire destroyed much of the building in 1897. No copies were known to have been made, though rumors persisted that Marshal Hollister had removed certain pages before filing the book as evidence. The Concaid sisters, Margaret, 28, and Elizabeth, 24, had arrived in Lordsburg in the spring of 1887. Their arrival coincided with the mysterious disappearance of Gerald Watson. According to tax records preserved in the Hidalgo County Courthouse, the sisters claimed to have purchased the property from Watson, though no bill of sale was ever registered. The few who remembered Watson described him as a heavy-set man with a fondness for expensive bourbon and young women. After the Concaid sisters took over his business, Watson was never seen again. A telegraph operator named Edwin Morris later testified that he had transmitted a message from Watson to an unknown recipient in St. Louis approximately 1 week before the businessman's disappearance. Morris could not recall the exact content of the message, but remembered it contained the phrase, "unusual ladies arriving from the east," and something about requiring immediate departure. Morris's testimony was taken in 1890 during the territorial investigation, but was subsequently excluded from the official record for reasons that were never made clear. Margaret Concaid was described in a newspaper clipping from the Silver City Enterprise as a handsome woman of commanding presence, with hair the color of desert sand and eyes that seemed to look through a man rather than at him. Her sister Elizabeth was rarely mentioned, though those who encountered her noted her unusual silence and the fact that she never ventured beyond the property without Margaret at her side. A daguerreotype photograph, discovered in 1957 in a collection of items belonging to the former owner of the Lordsburg General Store, shows two women standing in front of the Shakespeare Street establishment. The taller woman, presumably Margaret, stands slightly forward, her face clearly visible beneath a fashionable hat. The second woman, presumably Elizabeth, stands partially in shadow, her features indistinct. What makes the photograph particularly intriguing to researchers is that the shadow cast by Margaret does not align with the angle of sunlight evident elsewhere in the image, a discrepancy that photographic experts have attributed to damage to the original plate rather than any unusual circumstance during the taking of the photograph. The sisters' establishment offered more than the typical services expected from such a place. Men who frequented their business spoke of elaborate dinners, rare imported liquors, and private rooms decorated with tapestries and furnishings that seemed out of place in a frontier town. More curious were the rumors that Margaret Concaid possessed an uncanny ability to know things about her clients, personal details they had never shared with anyone in Lordsburg. According to an account given by Lawrence Sullivan, a silver miner who frequented the establishment, Margaret once greeted him by asking about his daughter's recovery from scarlet fever, information Sullivan had received by letter that very morning and had shared with no one in town. When Sullivan asked how she knew about his daughter's illness, Margaret reportedly smiled and said only that news travels in mysterious ways through the desert air. Sullivan later told a territorial investigator that he found the incident unsettling enough that he did not return to the sisters' place for several weeks. Another client, a cattle buyer named Richard Harmon, reported that during a private dinner with Margaret, she accurately described the interior of his childhood home in Pennsylvania, a place she could not possibly have seen. When Harmon expressed astonishment, Margaret explained that she had a gift for seeing places through the eyes of others. Harmon interpreted this as meaning she had spoken with someone from his hometown, though he could not imagine who that might have been. Perhaps most disturbing was the account provided by Dr. William Fleming, the town's physician, who was called to the Concaid establishment in July 1889 to treat what Margaret described as her sister's nervous condition. Fleming later told Marshall Hollister that upon examining Elizabeth, he found her in a catatonic state, unresponsive to external stimuli, yet with eyes that followed his movements around the room. What struck Fleming as particularly odd was that Elizabeth's pupils contracted and dilated in patterns that did not correspond to changes in light. When he mentioned this to Margaret, she reportedly said, "Yes, she sees differently now," a statement Fleming found medically nonsensical but somehow disturbing. Into this setting rode Daniel Bishop, a bounty hunter, known throughout the New Mexico Territory for his methodical pursuit of fugitives and the high percentage of his quarry that arrived at jails already deceased. Bishop had built his reputation in the aftermath of the Lincoln County War, tracking down the scattered remnants of both factions. A tintype photograph preserved in the Territorial Records Office in Santa Fe shows Bishop as a lean man with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that reveal nothing of the man behind them. Bishop's background before his arrival in the territory was largely unknown to his contemporaries. Military records indicate a Daniel Bishop served in the Union Army during the Civil War, assigned to a unit tasked with pursuing deserters, experience that would have prepared him well for his later profession. The military Daniel Bishop received a commendation for capturing 17 deserters in a single month, all of whom were returned alive to face court-martial. This stands in stark contrast to the bounty hunter's later reputation for bringing in his quarry dead rather than alive. A journal believed to have belonged to Bishop was discovered in 1935 during the demolition of an adobe building in Santa Fe that had once housed a boarding house frequented by bounty hunters and other itinerant law enforcement personnel. The journal, covering the period from 1874 to 1883, details Bishop's transformation from a man who prided himself on capturing fugitives alive to one who came to believe that death is often the most efficient form of justice. The journal makes repeated references to an incident in West Texas involving the escape and subsequent recapture of a murderer named Jacob Hardin, though the specific details of this incident are never fully explained. What is clear from the journal is that Bishop developed an unusual methodology for tracking his quarry. Rather than relying solely on physical evidence, such as footprints or witness accounts, Bishop wrote of attempting to enter the mind of the fugitive, to see through their eyes, and anticipate their movements. He described this process as initially difficult and mentally exhausting, but becoming easier with practice. In the final entry, dated December 15, 1883, Bishop wrote, "I have become too proficient at seeing through other eyes. Sometimes I fear I may lose myself in another's vision." According to the Lordsburg Telegraph Office log, Bishop arrived on September 30, 1889, in pursuit of a man named Frederick Walton, wanted for the murder of 2 miners in Silver City. The log contains a response from the Silver City Marshal confirming a $500 reward for Walton, dead or alive. The registration book from the Lordsburg Hotel contains an entry for September 30th showing Bishop's name, subsequently crossed out with a notation, "Canceled. Guest found alternative lodging." The hotel clerk, Jonathan Hayes, later told investigators that Bishop had initially reserved a room, but returned approximately 1 hour later to cancel the reservation, saying only that he had found more suitable accommodations. Hayes recalled that Bishop appeared distracted during this conversation, repeatedly glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to enter the hotel lobby. What brought Bishop to the Concaid sisters' establishment remains uncertain, though several accounts suggest he took a room there rather than at the town's hotel. The desert holds secrets well. The dry air preserves what would quickly decay in more humid climates. Bodies mummify rather than decompose. Blood turns to dark powder that can be mistaken for the omnipresent red dust. Perhaps this explains why what happened remained undiscovered for so long. The events of the next few days must be reconstructed from fragmentary accounts, many of which contradict one another. What seems clear is that Bishop spent much of October 1st and 2 moving about Lordsburg, speaking with various residents, and showing them a crude sketch of Frederick Walton. Several people reported seeing Bishop enter saloons, the general store, and even the small office of the local newspaper, the Lordsburg Advance. The newspaper's editor, Clarence Wilson, later stated that Bishop had asked to review recent editions, paying particular attention to the section listing new arrivals in town. On the evening of October 2nd, Bishop was observed having dinner at the Concaid establishment by a freight driver who delivered supplies there weekly. The driver, whose name is recorded only as Martinez in Hollister's notes, reported that Bishop dined alone but appeared to be watching the main entrance with particular attention. Martinez also noted that Elizabeth Concaid was absent from her usual post near the bar while Margaret moved among the customers with her customary ease. On October 3, 1889, a man matching Frederick Walton's description was seen entering the Concaid establishment shortly after sundown. The witness, a blacksmith named Howard Jenkins, later told the marshal that he recognized Walton from a wanted poster, but thought little of it at the time. "Men go to the sister's place for all manner of reasons," he was quoted as saying. "It wasn't my business to interfere." Jenkins's account is corroborated by an entry in the personal diary of Abigail Collins, the wife of the Methodist minister, who noted from her window that evening, "A rough-looking stranger just entered that den of iniquity across town, yet another soul drawn to sin, Mrs." Collins, known for her vigilant monitoring of activities at the Concaid establishment, made no mention of seeing the man leave, despite her habit of recording the comings and goings until she retired to bed at approximately 10 o'clock each evening. That same evening, according to the night clerk at the telegraph office, Bishop sent a wire to the Silver City marshal stating, "Quarry located, will deliver tomorrow." This was the last known communication from Daniel Bishop. The telegraph clerk, Peter Simmons, later added a detail to his account that was not included in the official report. According to Simmons, when Bishop handed him the message to transmit, the bounty hunter's hand was trembling slightly, something Simmons found noteworthy, because he had met Bishop on previous occasions and had always been struck by the man's steady nerves. When Simmons commented on this, Bishop reportedly said, "Something doesn't feel right about this one," but declined to elaborate further. The following 3 days passed without incident. No one reported seeing Bishop, Walton, or anything unusual at the Concaid establishment. The sisters continued their business, entertaining the local miners and railroad men who could afford their services. It wasn't until October 7th, when a package arrived at the marshal's office, that the first hint of something amiss emerged. The package, wrapped in oilcloth and bearing no return address, contained Bishop's distinctive silver badge. Tucked beneath it was a bank draft for $500 and a note written in an elegant feminine hand. Payment rendered for services complete. The marshal, James Hollister, found this peculiar enough to warrant a visit to the Concaid establishment. The bank draft itself became a subject of interest during the subsequent investigation. Drawn on the First National Bank of Santa Fe, it was made out to D. Bishop and signed by Margaret Concaid. Bank records confirmed that Margaret had opened an account at the Santa Fe Bank in April 1887, shortly after arriving in Lordsburg, with an initial deposit of $5,000 in gold coins, an amount that raised questions about the sisters' financial background that were never satisfactorily answered. According to Hollister's official report, his conversation with Margaret Concaid revealed nothing suspicious. She claimed Bishop had indeed captured Walton and departed with his prisoner before dawn on October 4th, heading towards Silver City. When Hollister inquired about the badge and bank draft, Margaret suggested Bishop must have left them behind intentionally, perhaps as payment for room and board. The marshal noted that Margaret's explanation seemed plausible, if somewhat unusual, and he had no grounds to pursue the matter further. What Hollister's report doesn't mention is what several residents of Lordsburg later recalled: the unusual amount of activity at the Concaid place in the pre-dawn hours of October 4th. A freight driver named Samuel Cooper, whose route took him past the establishment at approximately 4:30 that morning, reported seeing Margaret Concaid and another woman loading what appeared to be a large trunk into a wagon. Cooper noted that the other woman kept her face hidden, but her build and height matched those of Elizabeth Concaid. Cooper's account was corroborated by Jacob Weiss, a baker who began his workday at 3 a.m., and whose route to his shop took him within view of the rear of the Concaid property. Weiss reported seeing a wagon departing from behind the establishment shortly before 5 a.m., driven by a woman he believed to be Margaret Concaid. Weiss also noted that the wagon appeared to be heavily loaded as the horse strained against the harness on the slight incline leading to the main road. Perhaps most intriguing was the statement provided by Eliza Johnson, who worked as a laundress for several establishments in Lordsburg, including the Concaid place. Johnson told investigators that when she arrived for her regular collection on October 5th, Margaret informed her that there would be no laundry that week as they had already taken care of it. Johnson found this odd, as in the 2 years she had worked for the sisters, they had never before declined her services. She also noted that Margaret appeared unusually tired, with dark circles under her eyes, and that there was no sign of Elizabeth during her visit. Here, the official record falls silent for nearly 3 weeks. Business in Lordsburg continued as usual. The Concaid sisters entertained their clients, the mines produced their ore, and the railroad brought supplies, and took away the products of the desert's harsh bounty. If anyone noticed anything unusual about the sisters or their establishment during this time, they did not report it to the authorities. One curious detail emerges from the account books of the Lordsburg General Store. On October 10th, Margaret Concaid purchased an unusually large quantity of salt, 50 pounds according to the ledger entry. When the store owner, Abraham Goldstein, inquired about the purpose of such a large purchase, Margaret reportedly explained that she was planning to preserve meat for the winter months. Goldstein later recalled thinking this explanation peculiar, as the Concaid establishment typically purchased its meat fresh from the local butcher on a daily basis. Another anomaly during this period appears in the register of the Lordsburg Post Office. Between October 4th and October 20th, Margaret Concaid received 3 packages from a medical supply company in San Francisco. The postal clerk, Emily Richardson, later testified that such deliveries were not unusual, as Margaret regularly received packages from various sources. What struck Richardson as odd was that these particular packages were marked urgent and handle with care, designations she had not observed on previous deliveries to the Concaid address. The silence broke on October 26, 1889, when a Mexican vaquero named Miguel Ortiz discovered what he initially thought was a coyote's meal while tracking stray cattle approximately 15 miles south of Lordsburg. What he found instead, according to his statement to the marshal, was a human arm protruding from the sand. The arm bore a distinctive scar that would later be identified as matching one described in Daniel Bishop's military records from his service during the Civil War. Ortiz's full account, recorded in Spanish and later translated for the territorial authorities, includes details not found in the English summary provided to Marshal Hollister. Ortiz described finding not only the arm, but also a scatter of small personal items nearby, including a silver collar stud engraved with the initials D.B. and a small book that appeared to be a Catholic prayer book. Most significantly, Ortiz reported that the area surrounding the partial remains showed signs of having been disturbed by something other than animals, parallel grooves in the sand that he interpreted as drag marks, as if something heavy had been pulled away from the burial site. Ortiz's discovery prompted Marshal Hollister to organize a search party. Over the next 2 days, they uncovered the remains of 2 men buried in shallow graves within a 5-mile radius of the initial discovery. One set of remains was identified as Daniel Bishop, though the official report notes that identification was complicated by the fact that the body was missing its head. The second body was presumed to be Frederick Walton, though no definitive identification could be made due to the condition of the remains. The report filed by Dr. Fleming, who examined the remains at the marshal's request, contained several observations that would later take on greater significance. Fleming noted that Bishop's body showed evidence of having been treated with substances intended to delay decomposition, specifically mentioning the presence of salt, and what appeared to be a chemical preservative similar to those used in medical specimens. Fleming also observed that the decapitation had been performed with surgical precision, using a sharp instrument rather than the rough cutting that might be expected in an act of violence. The second body, presumed to be Walton's, exhibited no such preservation techniques and was in a state of advanced decomposition, consistent with the time that had elapsed since his disappearance. Fleming noted, however, that this body also showed evidence of skilled post-mortem intervention. specifically a precise incision running from the base of the skull to the lower back, consistent with what Fleming described as access to the spinal column. When Marshal Hollister returned to Lordsburg to confront the Concaid sisters, he found their establishment empty. According to neighbors, the sisters had departed 3 days earlier, claiming they were traveling to El Paso to purchase new furnishings. They had not returned. A subsequent search of the property revealed nothing immediately suspicious. The rooms were tidy. Personal belongings appeared to have been packed in an orderly fashion, and there was no sign of violence or hurried departure. It was only when Hollister examined the cellar of the establishment that the first hints of something truly disturbing emerged. Behind a false wall constructed with considerable skill, the marshal discovered a small room containing various surgical implements, several large glass jars containing unidentified substances, and a leather-bound journal. The journal, according to Hollister's report, contained writings of a disturbed nature and detailed procedures that the marshal declined to describe in an official document. Hollister's personal diary, discovered among his effects after his death in 1904, offers a more candid assessment of the hidden room and its contents. Hollister described the room as a chamber of horrors disguised as a scientific study. The surgical implements, he wrote, included several devices of unusual design that appeared to be custom-made rather than standard medical equipment. The glass jars contained organs preserved in alcohol, including what Hollister believed to be 3 human brains, each labeled with initials and dates. Most disturbing to Hollister was the leather-bound journal, which he described as containing the ravings of a mind that has ventured into territories where no human understanding should go. According to Hollister's diary, the journal detailed experiments aimed at what its author called the transference of the conscious self from one vessel to another. The descriptions were couched in pseudo-scientific language that Hollister found difficult to follow, but the underlying concept appeared to involve the belief that human consciousness could be extracted from one body and implanted into another through a combination of surgical procedures and what the journal called mental alignment. A telegraph was sent to authorities in El Paso and other surrounding communities, instructing them to be on the lookout for the Concaid sisters. No responses indicated any sightings. It was as if Margaret and Elizabeth had vanished into the desert air. The investigation might have ended there, another unsolved mystery in a territory that had seen its share of violence and disappearances. Had it not been for the arrival of Pinkerton detective Abigail Reed in Lordsburg on November 9, 1889. Reed's presence was unusual for multiple reasons. Female detectives were rare, particularly in frontier territories, and the Pinkertons typically did not involve themselves in local matters without a client. Reed herself was something of an enigma. According to Pinkerton agency records, she had joined the organization in 1885 after demonstrating exceptional investigative skills during a case involving the disappearance of a Chicago businessman's daughter. Prior to her employment with the Pinkertons, Reed had worked as a nurse in a Philadelphia hospital specializing in mental disorders. This medical background would prove relevant to her investigation in Lordsburg. According to Reed's credential letter presented to Marshal Hollister upon her arrival, she had been hired by the family of Daniel Bishop to investigate his disappearance. What her credentials didn't explain was how Bishop's family knew he was missing before the discovery of his body, or why they would hire a Pinkerton rather than simply inquiring with the territorial authorities. Reed's investigation began where Hollister's had effectively ended, with the leather-bound journal found in the hidden cellar room. While the marshal had deemed its contents too disturbing to detail in his reports, Reed spent 3 days studying the journal, making extensive notes, and occasionally requesting clarification from the town's doctor on medical terminology. Dr. Fleming later recalled that Reed's questions focused particularly on neurological matters, the structure of the brain, the nature of consciousness, and contemporary theories regarding memory and personality. Fleming found her inquiries oddly specific and somewhat beyond his expertise as a general practitioner. When he suggested she might find better answers in medical journals or by consulting a specialist in nervous disorders, Reed reportedly replied, "I'm not seeking conventional explanations, doctor. I'm trying to understand the mind that wrote these pages." On November 12th, Reed departed Lordsburg for Silver City, taking the journal with her despite Hollister's objections. Before leaving, she left a sealed envelope with instructions that it should be opened only if she did not return within 1 week. When Reed failed to return or send word by November 19th, Hollister opened the envelope. The contents of that envelope were subsequently sealed by order of Territorial Judge William Bristol in December 1889, with instructions that they not be opened for 50 years. When the seal was finally broken in 1939, many of the documents had deteriorated to the point of illegibility. Those that could be read contained Reed's analysis of the journal and her theories regarding the Concaid sisters. According to the fragments that survived, Reed believed the journal provided evidence that Margaret and Elizabeth Concaid were not sisters at all, but rather the same person. The elaborate deception, maintained over years, involved careful timing of appearances and the use of various cosmetics and prosthetics to create the illusion of two distinct individuals. More disturbing were Reed's notes suggesting that the journal detailed experimental procedures involving human subjects, procedures aimed at what the journal's author called the transference of consciousness. Reed's notes indicated that she believed Bishop and Walton were not the first victims of these experiments. The journal referenced at least 7 prior attempts dating back to 1883, when the author was apparently located in St. Louis, Missouri. Reed had traced a series of disappearances in that city to a boarding house operated by a woman named Mary Concaid, who left the city suddenly in 1885 following the disappearance of a police detective investigating one of the missing persons cases. The final legible page of Reed's notes contained her intention to travel to a location approximately 30 miles southeast of Silver City, where she believed the Concaid woman might be continuing her work. The specific location was lost to deterioration, and no record exists of Reed ever reaching Silver City or any destination beyond. What remained unclear from Reed's fragmented notes was why she believed Margaret and Elizabeth were the same person rather than actual sisters engaged in collaborative criminal activity. This question would remain unanswered until the discovery of additional materials decades later. The Lordsburg town records indicate that the building that housed the Concaid establishment burned to the ground in February 1890. The fire, which occurred during a dust storm, spread quickly and destroyed several adjacent structures. The official cause was listed as unknown, though speculation ranged from a knocked-over lantern to deliberate arson intended to eliminate any remaining evidence. A rarely cited addendum to the fire report, filed by a volunteer firefighter named Patrick O'Malley, mentioned that while searching the ruins for potential survivors, he discovered what appeared to be a small metal box in what would have been the cellar of the Concaid building. The box, according to O'Malley, contained several glass vials filled with a clear liquid and labeled with chemical formulas he did not recognize. O'Malley turned the box over to Marshal Hollister, but no record of its contents appears in the official investigation files. For nearly 2 decades, the matter of the Concaid sisters, Daniel Bishop, and Frederick Walton faded from public memory. Lordsburg continued to grow. New Mexico achieved statehood in 1912, and the Wild West gradually gave way to the 20th century. The case might have remained forgotten entirely had it not been for a discovery made during the construction of a new county courthouse in Silver City in 1908. Workers excavating the foundation discovered a sealed metal box approximately 6 feet below ground level. Inside the box was a glass jar containing what the county medical examiner reluctantly identified as a human head, preserved in alcohol. Accompanying the jar was a sheet of paper bearing only the initials DB and a date, Oster 4, 1889. The medical examiner's report, filed with the county clerk but subsequently removed from public access, described the preserved head in clinical detail. The examiner noted that the head had been separated from the body with exceptional skill, preserving the integrity of major blood vessels and neurological structures. More unusual was the examiner's observation that the brain appeared to have been partially removed and then replaced, with evidence of precise incisions and subsequent closure at the base of the skull. The discovery prompted a brief reopening of the investigation into the deaths of Bishop and Walton, but with most of the original witnesses either deceased or relocated, little progress was made. The preserved head was eventually buried in the Silver City Cemetery under a marker bearing Daniel Bishop's name, though no relatives came forward to claim the remains. In 1914, a librarian at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque received a package containing what appeared to be the missing pages from the journal found in the Concaid cellar. The accompanying note, unsigned, stated only, "To complete the historical record." The librarian, uncertain what to make of the pages, filed them away in the university's archives, where they remained undisturbed until a graduate student researching frontier justice discovered them in 1952. The librarian's acquisition log contains a brief description of the pages, noting that they appeared to be written in the same hand as the journal fragments already in the university's possession, but that the content related to more recent experiments conducted between 1890 and 1913. The log entry concludes with the librarian's personal observation, "I cannot determine if these are genuine historical documents or the work of someone with a macabre imagination. In either case, they are disturbing enough that I hesitate to make them freely available to the public." The student, Thomas Whelan, spent several months attempting to authenticate the pages and connect them to the Lordsburg case. His research led him to the sealed records from the 1889 investigation, which had by then been transferred to the state archives in Santa Fe. What Whelan found in those records apparently disturbed him enough that he abandoned his research and left the university without completing his degree. Before departing, Whelan left his notes with his faculty advisor, Dr. Eleanor Garrison. Dr. Garrison, after reviewing the materials, contacted the New Mexico State Police regarding certain aspects of Whelan's findings. The subsequent investigation resulted in all materials related to the case being classified and restricted from public access in 1953. Dr. Garrison herself refused to discuss the matter further, even with colleagues in her department. A colleague of Dr. Garrison, speaking on condition of anonymity in 1967, claimed that Whelan had discovered evidence suggesting that someone using variations of the Concaid name had been involved in at least 12 disappearances across New Mexico, Arizona, and Colorado between 1890 and 1950. According to this source, Whelan had compiled photographs from local newspapers showing a woman present in multiple communities where disappearances occurred, a woman who, despite the passage of decades, appeared remarkably unchanged in her physical appearance. In 1967, during renovations to the old Silver City Jail, workers discovered a small space between the original adobe walls and a later addition. Inside this space was a tin box containing a Pinkerton badge and identification papers belonging to Abigail Reed. Also in the box was a folded piece of paper containing what appeared to be a map of an area in the Burough Mountains, with an X marking a location approximately 25 miles southeast of Silver City. The discovery of Reed's badge confirmed that the detective had indeed reached Silver City, contrary to Marshal Hollister's assumption that she had disappeared en route. How her badge and identification came to be hidden in the wall of the jail remains unknown. The jail records from November 1889 contain no mention of Reed being detained or even visiting the facility. A state police investigation of the marked location revealed the ruins of a small stone structure, long abandoned. Inside, they discovered evidence suggesting it had once been used as some kind of medical facility. The investigating officer's report described the structure as consisting of 3 rooms, a main area that appeared to have served as both living quarters and operating theater, a smaller room that contained what resembled laboratory equipment, and a third space excavated beneath the stone floor that one officer likened to a storage cellar for specimens. This subterranean room contained shelf-like recesses carved into the rock walls, some of which still held fragments of glass containers. Among the items recovered were surgical tools, similar to those described in Marshall Hollister's original report from the Concaid cellar, and several glass jars containing unidentifiable preserved specimens. The investigation also uncovered a pit behind the structure containing what forensic examination would later determine to be the remains of at least 4 individuals. One set of remains, identified through dental records, belonged to Abigail Reed. The others could not be identified, though one was determined to be female and approximately the same age as Elizabeth Concaid would have been in 1889. The forensic report, heavily redacted before being filed with the state archives, noted that Reed's remains showed evidence of extensive surgical intervention consistent with the procedures described in the Concaid Journal. Specifically, the report mentioned incisions at the base of the skull and along the spinal column that appeared to have been performed while Reed was still alive, based on evidence of bone healing around the surgical sites. The final piece of this disturbing puzzle emerged in 1968, when the daughter of a deceased Silver City resident contacted the state police regarding materials she had found while settling her mother's estate. The woman, who requested anonymity, claimed her mother had worked as a nurse at the Silver City Hospital from 1915 until 1940. Among her mother's possessions was a sealed envelope labeled, "To be destroyed upon my death." The daughter, unable to bring herself to follow these instructions without knowing the contents, opened the envelope and found what appeared to be pages from a personal diary. The entries, dating from 1923 to 1926, detailed the nurse's interactions with a patient at the hospital known only as Mrs. Smith. According to the diary, Mrs. Smith had been brought to the hospital suffering from severe burns in 1923 and remained there until her death in 1926. The diary described Mrs. Smith as having been found by a rancher, badly burned and nearly dead, in an isolated cabin in the Burough Mountains that had caught fire during a lightning storm. The rancher transported her to Silver City, where she was admitted to the hospital with burns covering approximately 40% of her body. Despite the severity of her injuries, Mrs. Smith survived, though she remained disfigured and in poor health for the remainder of her life. What made the diary entries disturbing was the nurse's description of Mrs. Smith's behavior. The patient apparently alternated between 2 distinct personalities, one cold and calculating, the other timid and childlike. More concerning were the nurse's observations that these personality shifts seemed to coincide with physical changes in the patient's appearance, changes subtle enough that other staff dismissed them as tricks of light or the effects of medication. The diary recorded that during periods when the dominant personality was present, Mrs. Smith spoke with precision and authority, using medical and scientific terminology that the nurse found surprising in someone with no apparent medical training. During these periods, Mrs. Smith would often request writing materials and spend hours making entries in a journal that she kept secured beneath her mattress. When the secondary personality emerged, Mrs. Smith became fearful and confused, often asking for Margaret, and claiming that she was being held against her will. The diary also recorded fragments of conversations with Mrs. Smith during what the nurse called her Margaret episodes. During these periods, the patient spoke of experiments in consciousness transfer and claimed to have discovered the secret to housing 2 souls in a single vessel. In her final entry regarding Mrs. Smith, the nurse wrote that she had come to believe the patient was not suffering from delusions, but was instead describing actual events. Events the nurse found too horrifying to record even in her private diary. The nurse noted that as Mrs. Smith's health deteriorated in early 1926, the transitions between personalities became more frequent and less predictable. On several occasions, the nurse observed Mrs. Smith engaged in what appeared to be arguments with herself, her voice shifting between two distinct patterns of speech, as if two people were using the same vocal cords. During one such episode, the nurse recorded hearing Mrs. Smith say in the authoritative voice, "You've served your purpose, Elizabeth. It's time to let go," followed immediately by a response in the timid voice, "You promised we would always be together." Perhaps most disturbing was the nurse's account of Mrs. Smith's final days. As death approached, the patient became increasingly agitated, insisting that she needed to complete one final procedure before it was too late. According to the diary, Mrs. Smith attempted to persuade the nurse to help her obtain surgical instruments, claiming that, with the proper tools, she could ensure her work would continue even after her death. When the nurse refused, Mrs. Smith reportedly became enraged, displaying a physical strength that seemed impossible given her weakened condition. The state police investigation concluded that Mrs. Smith may have been Margaret Concaid, having survived the decades by assuming new identities. The investigation also theorized that the female remains found at the Burough Mountain site might have belonged to Elizabeth Concaid, suggesting that Margaret's experiments ultimately failed and resulted in her sister's death. However, this theory was complicated by hospital records indicating that when Mrs. Smith died in 1926, the attending physician noted something unusual in his report. Patient expired at 3:17 p.m. At moment of death, facial features appeared to undergo significant relaxation, resulting in an appearance noticeably different from that observed during life, almost as if a different person entirely. A photograph taken of the deceased, Mrs. Smith, attached to the hospital's death certificate, shows a woman who bears little resemblance to the descriptions of either Margaret or Elizabeth Concaid from 1889. However, a forensic analyst who examined the photograph in 1968 noted that extensive burn scarring could have altered the woman's appearance significantly, making identification, based on the photograph alone, inconclusive. What remained unexplained was how Margaret Concaid, if indeed she was Mrs. Smith, had survived the fire that supposedly injured her, when the stone structure in the Burough Mountains showed evidence of having burned many years earlier. The state police speculated that there might have been a second structure, perhaps the cabin mentioned in the rancher's account, though no trace of such a building was found during their investigation of the area. The nurse's diary contained one final detail that would prove significant to later researchers. In an entry dated January 15, 1926, she recorded that Mrs. Smith had entrusted her with a small package to be delivered to an address in Santa Fe after her death. The nurse wrote that she had agreed to this request, but had privately decided to examine the contents before sending it. Inside the package, she found a small notebook containing what appeared to be instructions for a surgical procedure, along with a glass vial of clear liquid labeled only with a chemical formula. The nurse claimed to have destroyed both items, finding them too disturbing to pass along, though she did not elaborate on the specific nature of the contents that caused her such concern. The case was officially closed in 1968. With all materials related to the investigation sealed in the state archives. The sealing order, signed by the governor, specified that the records should remain closed for 75 years due to their disturbing nature and lack of contemporary relevance. This official closure, however, did not prevent continued interest in the case among certain researchers and historians. Throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, several individuals attempted to gain access to the sealed records, all without success. One such researcher, Dr. Robert Mitchell of the University of Arizona, published a paper in 1979 titled "Frontier Medicine and the Boundaries of Scientific Inquiry, the Concaid Case Reconsidered," in which he suggested that Margaret Concaid may have been conducting early experiments in neurosurgery rather than the more fantastical consciousness transfer described in various accounts. Mitchell's paper was largely dismissed by his academic peers, who considered it speculative at best. In 1985, a historical society in Silver City received an anonymous donation of materials purported to be from the personal collection of Dr. William Fleming, who had examined the bodies found in the desert in 1889. Among these materials was a journal containing Fleming's private thoughts on various medical cases he had encountered during his practice in New Mexico Territory. The entries relating to the Concaid case suggested that Fleming had been more disturbed by his findings than his official reports indicated. In one particularly noteworthy entry, dated November 5, 1889, Fleming wrote, "I cannot shake the impression that the mutilations found on Bishop's body were not acts of violence, but attempts at something more methodical, more purposeful. The precision of the incisions, the careful removal of certain parts while leaving others intact. These are not the actions of someone driven by anger or hate, but by curiosity or even scientific inquiry, however misguided." Fleming also recorded his impressions of Margaret Concaid, whom he had encountered several times in his professional capacity. He described her as a woman of unusual intelligence and composure, noting that she often asked him detailed questions about his medical training and seemed particularly interested in his knowledge of the nervous system. Fleming wrote that he had initially been flattered by her interest, but later came to find it unsettling, especially after she began to suggest theories about the relationship between the physical brain and what she called the seated consciousness that Fleming considered bordering on the heretical. The Historical Society, uncertain about the authenticity of these materials, consulted with the state archives. When officials from the archives arrived to examine the donation, they confiscated all items related to the Concaid case, citing the governor's sealing order from 1968. The Society's request for the return of the materials was denied, and the incident received no public attention beyond a small notice in the local newspaper regarding the donation of historical medical records to the state's collection. Yet even today, in certain remote areas of southern New Mexico, locals tell stories of strange lights seen in the Burough Mountains, and of a woman, or perhaps two women, who look remarkably similar, who occasionally appears in small towns, takes residence briefly, and shows an unusual interest in local missing persons cases. The stories are dismissed as folklore by authorities, but those who tell them insist there is truth behind the tales. A retired sheriff's deputy from Grant County, interviewed for a local history project in 1992, recounted an incident from the early 1960s when he was called to investigate reports of trespassers at an abandoned mining claim in the Burough Mountains. The deputy claimed that upon arriving at the site he found evidence of recent occupation, a campfire still warm, food supplies, and what appeared to be medical equipment of an unusual nature. Among the items he discovered was a notebook containing anatomical drawings focused on the human brain and spinal cord, with annotations in a precise, feminine handwriting. Before he could radio for assistance, the deputy heard movement in the surrounding brush and caught a glimpse of a figure he described as a woman in outdated clothing, moving with unusual speed for the rough terrain. By the time backup arrived, the campsite had been cleared of all the items the deputy had initially observed, leaving him with no evidence to support his report. Perhaps most disturbing is the account given by a Silver City Cemetery caretaker in 1962, who claimed that on the anniversary of Daniel Bishop's death, he observed a woman placing flowers on the bounty hunter's grave. When asked about her connection to Bishop, the woman reportedly smiled and said, "We share something intimate, a connection that transcends ordinary understanding." The caretaker noted that as she spoke, her voice seemed to shift between two distinct tones, as if two people were speaking in unison. The caretaker, Milton Hayes, provided additional details in a recorded interview conducted by a folklore researcher in 1965. Hayes described the woman as being of indeterminate age. She could have been 40 or 60, it was hard to tell, with features that seemed to change slightly depending on the angle from which he viewed her. Most unsettling to Hayes was the woman's eyes, which he described as containing a doubled quality, as if you were seeing two sets of eyes looking out from the same face. When the researcher suggested this might have been a trick of the light or Hayes's imagination, the caretaker insisted that he had observed the phenomenon clearly and that it had left him with a sense of unease so profound that he avoided that section of the cemetery for months afterward. In 1970, a professor of neuropsychology from the University of Colorado published a paper speculating on historical cases that might represent early attempts to understand multiple personality disorder, now known as dissociative identity disorder. The paper made brief reference to the Concaid case, suggesting that Margaret's apparent research into consciousness transfer might have been inspired by her observations of her sister's psychological condition. The paper theorized that Elizabeth might have suffered from a dissociative disorder and that Margaret, lacking the modern conceptual framework to understand it, had interpreted the condition through a more physical lens, believing that multiple consciousnesses were literally inhabiting her sister's body. This theory gained little traction among historians familiar with the case, who pointed out that it failed to account for the surgical evidence and the disturbing physical discoveries made throughout the investigation. However, the paper did prompt renewed interest in the psychological aspects of the case, leading several researchers to request access to the sealed records, requests that continued to be denied. The desert preserves its secrets well. In the dry air of New Mexico, things that should decay remain intact far longer than nature intended. Perhaps this is true not only of physical remains, but also of the darker aspects of human nature, the desires and obsessions that, like Bishop's preserved head, refuse to disappear completely into the dust of history. In 1997, during an archaeological survey of historically significant sites in the Burough Mountains, researchers discovered a small cave whose entrance had been obscured by a rock slide, estimated to have occurred in the 1940s. Inside the cave, they found evidence of human habitation, including the remnants of scientific equipment dating to the late 19th or early 20th century. Carbon dating of organic materials found at the site suggested it had been occupied intermittently between approximately 1890 and 1945. Among the artifacts recovered from the cave was a metal case containing glass slides prepared for microscopic examination. Analysis revealed that the slides held thin sections of human brain tissue preserved using techniques consistent with late 19th century methods. The journal's author, who identified herself only as M., described experiments in neural grafting and consciousness preservation that the archaeological team's report characterized as suggestive of both scientific inquiry and delusional thinking. The most recent documented incident potentially connected to the Concaid case occurred in 2005, when a nursing home in Las Cruces reported the unusual death of a resident who had been admitted 3 years earlier with no identification, beyond the name Mary Smith, and no known family contacts. More puzzling was the discovery of a journal written in a cramped, hurried hand dating from 1943 to 1945, which referenced earlier work conducted in Lordsburg and Silver City. According to staff reports, in the weeks before her death, the elderly woman, estimated to be in her 90s, began to speak lucidly after years of near catatonia, addressing the nurses by name, despite having never been properly introduced to them. More disturbing were the woman's claims that she was not Mary Smith, but rather a woman named Elizabeth, who had been trapped for over a century. In her final days, the woman reportedly alternated between two distinct personalities, one confused and frightened, the other coldly analytical, and given to discussing complex medical procedures despite having no apparent medical background. When a nurse asked how someone could be trapped for over a century, the woman reportedly replied, "When you learn to move between vessels, time becomes flexible." After the woman's death, a search of her few possessions revealed a small notebook containing entries dated 1889, written in a handwriting that did not match samples of the woman's writing from her period of lucidity in the nursing home. The notebook contained detailed anatomical drawings and what appeared to be surgical notes, including repeated references to DB and the successful integration of consciousness across prepared neural pathways. What really happened in Lordsburg in the autumn of 1889? Did Margaret Concaid discover some terrible method of consciousness transfer? Did she somehow continue her work through the decades that followed? Or is this simply a case where the human mind, confronted with the brutal realities of frontier justice, created elaborate explanations for what was merely another episode of Western violence? The records remain sealed. The locations have changed with time and development. Those who might have known the truth are long dead. All that remains are fragments, a badge here, a journal page there, rumors and whispers that drift across the desert like tumbleweeds, insubstantial yet persistent. And perhaps, somewhere in the vastness of the New Mexico desert, in a place where the modern world has not yet fully intruded, there stands a small stone structure where experiments continue, experiments conducted by hands that should have turned to dust a century ago, guided by a mind that refused to accept the limitations of a single body. In 2015, a retired archivist from the New Mexico State Archives claimed in an anonymous online forum that before leaving his position, he had accessed the sealed Concaid files. According to his account, the files contained photographic evidence suggesting that the woman known as Margaret Concaid had been documented in at least 5 different locations across the Southwest between 1889 and 1965, appearing virtually unchanged despite the passage of decades. When asked to provide copies of these photographs, the archivist refused, stating only that after viewing the complete file, he had come to believe that some secrets should remain buried in the desert sand. Listen carefully if you find yourself in those empty spaces where the wind carries voices from nowhere. You might hear them, the Bordello sisters still whispering their secrets to the desert air. And if you encounter a woman whose eyes seem to look through you rather than at you, whose manner shifts subtly when you aren't quite watching, perhaps it would be wise to continue on your way. Some mysteries, after all, are better left unsolved. In the dry heat of the Chihuahuan Desert, where the Southern Pacific Railroad still cuts through Lordsburg like a steel lifeline to the outside world, locals say that on certain nights, particularly in October, a woman can sometimes be seen walking along the tracks east of town, in the vicinity where Thomas Finch found that blood-soaked satchel so many years ago. She walks with purpose, these witnesses claim, occasionally stopping to kneel and press her ear to the rails, as if listening for a train that never arrives. And in a small corner of the Silver City Cemetery, where a simple marker bears the name Daniel Bishop with no dates of birth or death, the caretakers have learned not to ask questions when they find fresh flowers on the grave each October 4th, placed there by hands that leave no footprints in the desert dust.